Morning, Chairman. You may begin.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting of the FDIC Board to order. We have several items on the summary agenda. Are there any questions or comments on the summary agenda? If none, may I have a motion to approve the summary agenda?
So moved.
Thank you. And a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? The motion is adopted. The first item on the discussion agenda is the FDIC's 2025 operating budget. Marshall Gentry and Tom Petticord will present the case.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present the proposed 2025 FDIC operating budget for the board's approval. The proposed budget was built by a senior management team over the past 5 months based on our expectations of what will happen over the next year in the banking system and the broader economy. The management team sought to limit the budget increase from year to year in light of the general positive economic output. In our view, the budget and staffing levels being presented for next year constitute a responsible and cost-effective proposal in light of that outlook. And the proposed budget also reaffirms management's commitment to continuing to work to transform our workplace culture. I'm going to ask Tom Petticord, our Deputy Director for Corporate Planning and Performance Management, to walk through the proposed budget. I'd like to thank the CPPM staff, the divisions and offices, and Tom in particular for the efforts in developing the budget. Tom?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'm pleased to be able to present to you the proposed 2025 FDIC operating budget. The first slide is one we've used year after year. It describes the process we go through each year to develop the budget. We first do a survey of the external environment, as well as looking at proposed one-time initiatives internally. And we develop a set of workload assumptions, and those drive then our budget estimates. It's a top-down process. We have division and office directors and other senior management officials meet at the beginning of the process, set some guidance. We develop the proposed budget at the staff level, and then we bring it all back together in October. And out of this, we establish a budget and we establish performance goals for the next year. And you can see, and I think you'll see this in the course of the presentation, that our budget and staffing levels are driven primarily by the economic and workload assumptions that we make. The current budget maintains current operational and readiness capabilities, while it does add new resources, as Marshall said, to support transformation of the FDIC's workplace culture. The proposed budget is not very much increased over 2024. It's a little over $3 billion. It's up about $64 million, or 2.2% from this year. As you remember, the budget is divided into 3 components. The ongoing operations component supports most continuing operations. The receivership funding budget supports the variable workload associated with bank closings and bank failures, and then the ensuing workload. And then the OIG budget is separately appropriated, and it's here primarily for information purposes for the board. The ongoing operations budget is up about $160 million. And that's almost entirely due to higher salary and benefit costs. The receivership funding budget has been coming down. We peaked a couple of years ago at $825 million. Last year, we brought it down to $350 million, and it's coming down in this proposal for 2025 to $250 million. It reflects, well, the increase a couple of years ago, of course, reflected the 3 large bank failures in early 2023. As we have completed the residual workload from those failures, we've been able to bring the proposed budget down in that component. The OIG budget is up about 5%, primarily due to higher salary and benefit costs. Okay. Yeah. There we go. The overall increase in the budget is primarily attributable to four things. First of all, scheduled salary and benefits increases under our existing compensation agreement. So even if we didn't add a position next year, there's a significant upward push under the compensation agreement to salaries and benefits. We've been experiencing high vacancy rates, but as this year has gone on, the vacancy rates have been coming down. We assumed a 93% occupancy rate for those authorized positions in 2024. As we have made progress, we think it's reasonable to assume that we'll fill 95% of our authorized positions. Historically, we've been more in the 3 to 4% range of vacancy, so we're getting back to that level. We make non-salary inflation adjustments every year using the assumptions made by OMB about the inflation rate. And finally, we have restored, this year we've used the $30 million contingency reserve that we typically have. We've used it several times in consultation with the board to fund activities related to the action plan. The budget proposes that we return the contingency reserve to $30 million. And then most of the remaining increase is attributable to costs related to action plan implementation, and we'll have some details later. Proposed 2025 staffing is 6,876, a little over 6,500 of those are permanent, and the 300 non-permanent are gradually coming down and going away as we complete non-core workload. 53 positions have been added in this budget, proposed in this budget, to support implementation of the action plan. There are 47 fewer authorized examiner and case manager positions because as we have gone through this year, we have had a reduction in the number of FDIC supervised institutions. And then in the DRR area, the Division of Resolutions and Receiverships, 18 non-permanent positions are being eliminated. They're all vacant. And that reflects, again, the decline in the residual workload from these three large bank failures. As I said at the beginning, we base this on economic and workload projections. I want to summarize the key ones for you. The number of, so the key assumption is the number of FDIC insured and supervised institutions will continue to decline next year. But of course, as we've been experiencing for a long time now, the asset size, the average asset size of these banks continues to grow and the complexity of the institution grows. So we have fewer institutions but greater complexity. We project that the banking industry will remain resilient, but we are always attuned to the fact that there are potential risks out there. High interest rates and geopolitical risks, we've mentioned several times in several years and now in a row. They continue to cause uncertainty. There are unrealized losses on securities and longer asset maturities that could lead to liquidity issues, such as we experienced in 2023. And there is concern about the continued deterioration in commercial real estate portfolios that poses potential risks. But while we are aware of those, and I think we've made an effort to maintain resources to ensure that we can respond quickly if things turn, the budget mostly assumes a continuing positive outlook economically and for the banking industry. Number of problem banks, I saw a story in the clips this morning about this. The number of problem banks has been rising very slowly over the last several quarters. At the most recent QBP, there were 68 problem banks. We are projecting that throughout 2025, the number will gradually rise, but all of that, even with the projections of where we would be at the end of the year, it's within the historical range for non-crisis periods where we assume a 1% to 2% problem bank rate when the industry is stable. The number of, and we've assumed that the number of and size of bank failures will continue at relatively low levels, but we will, of course, we have a permanent platform of staff that we don't reduce, so we're always maintaining our readiness to respond to potential failures. If we were to get an uptick in failures, we would come back to you and seek to raise the temporary staffing levels in DRR and other divisions. But as I said, the residual workload has been declining. We had 59 active receiverships at the end of November, beginning of December. We project that's going to decline to 45 by the end of next year. And during that period of time, we've kind of reached an equilibrium where the level of assets seems to be remaining relatively constant. We get rid of assets, but then we have small bank failures and we pick up assets. Okay, as I said, there's a lot of resources in this budget for the action plan implementation. There are 53 new positions and about $48 million. We've now established the Office of Professional Conduct and the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity. They would have respectively 30 and 20 positions. They're just beginning to fill those positions. And they both will are proposed to get contract money to do to provide support for investigations of complaints cases. Corporate University, there are 3 non-permanent positions in the budget and some contract dollars to support training, which is again assumed in 2025 to be training for all FDIC employees in person. We've hired a culture change advisor under contract. The board approved that. And next year, the estimate is that we will have $7.3 million worth of expenditures against that contract. And I think we've provided to each board member some detail on the tasks that would be performed under that contract. The Independent Transformation Monitor, there's another case for you today. The Independent Monitor has proposed a budget next year of $9.3 million, and this budget would approve that budget level. And then there is an action plan management office. There's things going on in OPC, things going on in OEEO, but then there's a set of initiatives to transform our workplace culture outside of those 2 offices, and those are being managed out of the Chief Operating Officer's organization. He has a set of FDIC detailees that will support this, and then has, of course, the Culture Change Advisor. Okay, so that is a quick overview of what's in this budget. You can see here the comparisons of the budget. In the middle column, that is our estimate of spending. We never spend all of the money that we budget. It seems to be a constant. The budget rises modestly next year, so 2.2% overall. You can see the trend of the budget over a 10-year period here. We were pretty flat through the 2020s and then stayed flat with the onset of the pandemic. But since the pandemic, we've been gradually increasing in our operational costs. 67% of the budget is salaries and benefits. So most of that is in that area, although there has been an increase in staff. This lets you see that just the continuing operations portion of the budget, the ongoing operations budget component. And we've been pretty steadily rising since 2020. Authorized staffing is up. Actually, authorized staffing is down. We have 7 fewer positions that are proposed in the budget. That's not a huge swing, but it is essentially flat staffing. Staffing trend, you can see here in the gap between the on-board and the authorized levels, you can see the vacancy rate that I referenced earlier, and you can see that it did widen in 2022, 2023. But as we have been coming through 2024, that gap has been narrowing. Hence the assumption that we'll close that gap further next year as we continue. If you think about major expense categories, as I said, the salaries and compensation portion of the budget is consistently year over year about 2/3 of the ongoing operations budget. We have a different model, obviously, in receivership funding where we rely primarily on non-permanent staff and contractual resources so that they're easy to upsize and downsize as that work gets completed. And then if you think about our three major business lines, insurance, supervision, and receivership management, consistently year after year, unless we're in a period of crisis, it is primarily in the supervision area that we devote our resources, typically a little bit more than half, and that continues again in 2025, and then smaller amounts for insurance and receivership management. So that's a quick overview of the proposed budget. Our recommendations to you are obviously to approve the budget that's in front of you, and with that, the staffing levels for next year. And I would be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Marshall. That was very helpful. I have a brief statement, and then I'll turn to the other members of the board. The FDIC board is considering today a proposed 2025 FDIC operating budget of just over $3 billion. The proposed budget reflects an increase of 2.1% from the 2024 FDIC operating budget. The ongoing operations component of the proposed budget is funded at $2.7 billion. That's an increase of about $161 million, or 6.3% from 2024, and that's attributable largely to higher salary and other costs. The receivership funding component of the proposed budget is funded at $250 million, a reduction of 28.6% from this year's budget, reflecting the completion of much of the post-failure workload associated with the three large regional bank failures that occurred in the first part of 2023. The budget we are approving today ensures that the FDIC will be able to continue next year fulfilling its important mission responsibilities for maintaining stability and public confidence in the nation's banking system. This includes bank supervision, the resolution of bank failures, and the protection of Americans who trust the FDIC to safeguard the funds they have deposited in FDIC-insured bank accounts. As staff noted, the banking system has continued to show resilience over the past year. As today's staff presentation noted, however, the industry still faces significant downside risks from the continued effects of inflation, volatility in market interest rates, and geopolitical uncertainty. These issues could cause credit quality, earnings, and liquidity challenges for the industry, and in addition, weakness in certain loan portfolios, particularly office properties, credit cards, auto and multifamily housing loans, continue to warrant close monitoring and will remain matters of ongoing supervisory attention by the FDIC. This budget will ensure that the FDIC has the resources to address those potential risks. It will sustain the enhanced capabilities the FDIC has developed to monitor large insured institutions on a continuing basis, to support early detection and action on emerging risks, resolve the failure of large institutions, and continue to fund ongoing initiatives to address the impact of new technologies and financial products on consumers, and to bring more people into the banking system. It will also provide funding to continue the FDIC's multi-year IT modernization effort to update mission-critical systems. Of particular importance, the budget also provides resources to implement our action plan for transforming our workplace culture to ensure that all employees feel safe, valued, and respected, and that complaints about employee misconduct are addressed quickly and effectively. It includes 53 new positions and almost $48 million to fund the work of the new offices of professional conduct and equal employment and the numerous initiatives being carried out under the FDIC's action plan. In closing, I would like to thank all the members of the FDIC board for their engagement in the formulation of this budget. I especially would like to thank Vice Chairman Hill for his cooperation and helpful suggestions in finalizing this budget. I'd also like to express my appreciation to all the FDIC employees who played a role in putting the proposed budget together. Their contributions and hard work have presented us with a responsible and forward-looking budget for 2025 that I'm pleased to support. That concludes my statement, Vice Chairman Hill.
Thanks, Chairman. I also have a brief statement. Today, the FDIC Board will vote on the operating budget for 2025. The initial budget that was authorized by the Chairman and distributed to the Board would have increased staffing by a net 105 positions, among other significant spending increases. I pushed back strongly and expressed my view that major decisions on changes in staffing or other spending should generally be left to the next board and leadership team. Following these discussions, the final budget will decrease staff by a net 7 positions compared to the status quo. The budget also reduces spending by $45 million compared to the initial budget shared with the board. In future years, my expectation is that the FDIC will explore more comprehensive operational efficiencies to ensure we are serving as responsible stewards of the Deposit Insurance Fund. I appreciate the willingness of the Chairman and staff to make significant concessions on this budget to reach consensus, and will vote in favor. Thank you.
Thank you. Director McKiernan?
Nothing for me, thank you.
Thank you. Director Sue?
Nothing for me.
Director Chopra?
Thanks to everybody involved in preparing it. I know it involves a sort of dragnet of all the divisions and everybody, so it's a lot of work, and I appreciate everything put into it. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further comments or questions on the budget, may I have a motion to approve the resolution regarding the FDIC's 2025 operating budget?
So moved.
Thank you. And a second? Thank you. I'll now call the roll for the vote. I vote aye. Vice Chairman Hill?
Aye.
Director McKiernan?
Aye.
Director Sue?
Aye.
Director Chopra?
Aye.
Thank you very much, and the motion is adopted. We now have a couple of matters that Director Chopra would like to bring to the attention of the board, so I'll turn to him.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by saying I think this is approaching the 2-year anniversary of both Director McKernan's and Vice Chair Hill's confirmation. I understand that this is the longest time of a same composition of 2 years for quite a bit of time, I think, maybe over a decade, where we've all been at one. And our first time meeting as a board actually was during the spring bank failures of 2023. And we always want to make sure that we are thinking ahead of the next crisis or the next set of issues in advance of them occurring. Ideally, we always have a playbook in advance. We receive lots of advice from the staff, but some of these involve very important questions of policy that often we need to think about together. So in that vein, I want to raise 2 issues just for the record, and if there's any comments on them, I would welcome that. Not for the basis of voting, not for the basis of editing here, but really to kick off the discussion in the hopes that there is a sustainable course forward over the years to come when they arise. Now, the first issue, I've circulated a discussion draft for a policy that would limit bank boards from depleting capital through share buybacks and dividends during times of stress in the financial system, such as when the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Treasury Secretary activate emergency authorities to support the financial system. Once an economic shock hits, limiting banks from buying back shares and paying dividends can be critical on the front end. When they do these buybacks and dividends, that depletes capital, giving money to the shareholders that is no longer available to absorb losses or to lend to customers and clients in a recovery phase. In addition, imposing limitations on an individual institution during a time of stress can raise questions in the capital markets about that individual institution's viability. In fact, it may be preferable for the entire system to be restricted from engaging in capital distributions, since it may actually reduce depositor runs in the aggregate. And during the last 3 periods of stress, regulators didn't impose restrictions on a system-wide basis, only on an individual institution basis. And this allowed some banks to reward executives and shareholders while the public is either directly or indirectly providing support or bailing out these firms. So I want to briefly highlight a few examples before turning to the discussion draft. Stress began to spread in the financial system in the summer of 2007, but the failure of investment banking giant Bear Stearns in March 2008 made it clear a crisis was beginning. The Federal Reserve established the first of many emergency lending facilities that month, declaring that there were, quote, unusual and exigent circumstances that necessitated extraordinary government support. Now, many banks reacted to this emergency in ways that I don't think totally made sense. They paid out roughly $12 billion in dividends in the second quarter of 2008, $11 billion in the third quarter, $8 billion in the fourth quarter, all the while the United States government was providing enormous support to the system through multiple mechanisms. In fact, during the full financial crisis period, almost every bank that received TARP bailout funds paid almost 34% of the amount they received in dividends. Put differently, banks were taking a large chunk of money from taxpayers and handed it over to shareholders instead of using that capital to help people not lose their homes, to help businesses stay afloat, and much more. Now, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic also shut down the entire economy. The Fed established more emergency lending facilities than it did in the 2008 crisis. And importantly, while share buybacks were limited, the banking industry did still pay out more than $50 billion in dividends in 2020. In March of 2023, after the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, and before the failure of First Republic, the Federal Reserve established the Bank Term Funding Program, emergency lending facility. Banks were allowed to borrow against the face value of certain securities that had lost significant market value. After 3 of the largest bank failures in U.S. history, while benefiting from an unprecedented emergency loan facility, banks paid out $54 billion in dividends and significantly more than that in buybacks in 2023. In other words, during the last 3 major periods of stress in which the public stepped in to backstop or bail out the financial system, regulators let banks hand out money to shareholders instead of keeping the money for loans and to avoid those bailouts in the first place. Now, let me turn to the discussion draft, which I think is a starting point to think through these issues before a crisis emerges. It clarifies that the FDIC views dividends and buybacks during a period of stress as marked by the existence of an emergency lending facility authorized by the Federal Reserve Board as an unsafe and unsound practice. Under this approach, the FDIC would use its temporary cease and desist enforcement authority to prevent insured banks from engaging in capital distributions. In instances in which bank subsidiaries wish to send dividends to the holding company to pay creditors or other expenses, that would still generally be permitted. I know that some automatic restrictions embedded in our rules on a bank-by-bank basis are based on regulatory capital levels. Those can be helpful for individual stress at an individual institution stress or an localized distress, even though regulatory capital is a delayed measure. But broader financial system distress, such as we saw in COVID-19 or in 2008, requires a quick system-wide approach. Now, over the long term, I think a rulemaking would be best, but we never know when the next crisis could hit. So understanding our policy posture in advance is appropriate. If banks make it through the crisis unscathed, they can make up for lost time and substantially raise their buybacks and dividend activity once we get through the storm and once there is no need for taxpayer or supported or emergency lending facilities. The policy under discussion seeks to ensure that banks are maintaining resources to absorb losses and lend when they need it the most. Often when a bank decides to suspend dividends, they really worry that they are raising their hand, that they're in trouble. So we need to think and protect the entire system, and I would hope we do not have a rushed discussion on this in the midst of a crisis, but do so before it occurs. So again, I want to raise this with the hope that over the next months, year, whatever it may be, we continue to think about this as a playbook before we have to make decisions in the fog of war. Go ahead, and then I'll.
Okay. Are there any further comment by members of the board in regard to Director Chopra?
I do have a short statement. Director Chopra's proposal would generally prohibit all FDIC supervised institutions from paying capital distributions when the Federal Reserve invokes emergency authority under Section 13(3) of the Federal Reserve Act. Although the board is not voting on this item, this proposal has a litany of problems, and I will briefly mention just a few. First, this would mean that if Section 13(3) is invoked, FDIC supervised institutions, which include most community banks, would be prohibited from paying distributions, while OCC and Federal Reserve supervised institutions would not. Second, it would mean that bank holding companies with profitable non-bank subsidiaries would generally be able to continue making distributions, while bank holding companies with only FDIC supervised subsidiaries generally would not. Third, it would mean that well-capitalized, well-rated banks that do not utilize government support would be prohibited from paying distributions, while non-banks that do utilize a Federal Reserve facility would not. As is well known, an industry-wide prohibition on banks' distributions makes banks less attractive as investments and hurts their ability to raise capital. The Federal Reserve designed its stress test program assuming that banks would continue to pay distributions during periods of economic stress. Furthermore, a blanket prohibition would make the probability of private capital stepping in to rescue struggling banks during such periods a common stability-enhancing occurrence over the years, far less likely, increasing the likelihood that such banks end up in FDIC receivership instead. This is an overly broad proposal that would put FDIC-supervised institutions at a significant disadvantage relative to their bank and non-bank peers. Thanks.
Watch it, watch it, watch it.
Thank you.
I was going to say, that's the strongest reaction I've ever gotten.
The flag did not like what you were saying, I guess.
Okay, any other comments from members of the board? Let me just say, as someone who was around during both the 2008 crisis and during the pandemic, the issue of dividend distributions during a time of stress by large institutions is a serious matter that raises significant safety and soundness and financial stability issues. And I just wanted to express my appreciation to Director Chopra for raising the issue for consideration by the board.
Thanks. And I'm going to raise my second issue, which is one that I think continues to be one that we are always wondering how to approach. When an insured bank is criminally convicted, that's not only a breach of law, it's also an abrogation of public trust that is fundamental to banking. And when it involves money laundering, we have a clear directive to consider whether a bank should maintain its status as an insured institution. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Congress was appalled by how permissive some banks were towards their obligations to prevent money laundering and terrorism finance. This concern crystallized with the case of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. It was a foreign bank with U.S. operations, and it allegedly banked Saddam Hussein, Manuel Noriega, and the Medellin drug cartel. The bank was then shut down when the full scope of its fraud and criminal activity became clear. So in 1992, Congress responded to this by stiffening the penalties imposed on banks engaged in criminal money laundering, among other enhancements to the anti-money laundering framework signed into law by President George H.W. Bush. The Annunzio Wiley Anti-Money Laundering Act requires the FDIC to initiate deposit insurance termination proceedings against state-chartered banks and savings associations that are criminally convicted of certain money laundering charges. For other related charges, the law affords the FDIC discretion as to whether it initiates the termination proceedings. The law establishes similar directives regarding charter revocation for criminally convicted national banks. Now, since the law was passed, we've seen a number of instances where criminal convictions or plea agreements may technically sidestep these automatic triggers. For example, a bank may be convicted of conspiracy to commit one of the specific triggering charges. Now, conspiracy itself is a separate charge that is not technically on the Annunzio Wiley list. We've also seen situations where bank holding companies convicted of the act's enumerated charges, even when the bank's subsidiary engaged in the misconduct. And bank holding companies are not covered by the charter revocation and deposit insurance termination penalties. It's clear we should be thoughtful about how to execute this 1992 statute. The draft discussion document of our enforcement policy would seek to address that. It would clarify that the FDIC intends to initiate deposit insurance termination proceedings against an insured depository institution criminally convicted of charges related to money laundering. If those charges are not technically enumerated in the Annunzio Wiley Act, the FDIC, as the discussion draft states, would still intend to initiate the proceedings under a separate statutory authority. Now, criminal convictions related to money laundering certainly meet the legal standard under that authority, a legal standard which includes unsafe and unsound practices and violating any applicable law or regulation, including civil laws, not just criminal laws. Now, to be clear, deposit insurance proceedings may not lead to deposit insurance termination. It can lead to nothing, or it can lead to limitations short of termination. But the law outlines a careful process and clear set of statutory factors for the FDIC to consider. Perhaps most importantly, the size or clout of the institution is not a factor. But the bottom line is simple. Banks are supposed to meet the convenience and needs of local communities, of households and businesses. If a bank is criminally convicted of meeting the convenience and needs of cartels or terrorists, Congress expects that appropriate sanctions are at least considered, and the discussion draft of the policy statement adheres to that directive. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to present these, and I do hope that before any state non-member bank or state chartered institution runs into trouble like this, we think about our policy in advance.
Thank you. Is there a comment from any other members of the board on this? Thank you, Director Chopra. And if there's no further business that any member of the board would like to raise, I think that concludes our agenda for this open meeting. Our open meeting is now adjourned, and we'll proceed to a closed session of the board. Thank you.